Trading customers only on selected tariffs. 1 month rollover. Terms apply.
Looking to grow your investments and generate a long-term income? The Scottish American Investment Company, also known as Saints, could help. Saints has been investing for over 150 years and focuses on growing capital as well as income by investing in a diverse range of companies from around the world. Saints is managed by Baillie Gifford, manager for some of the UK's best-known investment trusts. Find out key information and more at baileygifford.com. As with any investment, capital is at risk and income is not guaranteed.
Follow Times Radio on Twitter and stay up to date.
Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio with SSE, investing over £20 billion in homegrown energy. SSE, we power change. Verify at sse.com/change.
Well, it's coming up to 1 o'clock here on Times Radio, which means it's time for... Can you get to number 10? 10 questions for 10 jobs in my cabinet. The more you get right, the further you go up the greasy pole. If you get all the way to number 10, you become Prime Minister, and better still, win a DAB radio. Let's take a look at the cabinet so far. Chris, the part-time maths tutor in Bury St Edmunds, is Culture Secretary. And you know what? I'm going to jump ahead to Amy O'Connor from the charity Movember, who is Foreign Secretary, because we haven't got that much time. Who's on the line today? Who've we got?
Oh, hi, Hugo. It's Eddie from Northamptonshire.
What do you do in Northamptonshire, Eddie?
Mortgage advisor.
Excellent. Well, the many jobs you could have. Let's crack on.
Yep.
So, let's play Can You Get to Number 10? For Minister Without Portfolio, complete this well-known phrase, barking up the wrong...
Tree.
Yes. For Culture, Media and Sport, what is the name of the international dog show held annually in the United Kingdom since 1891, organised by the Kennel Club?
That'll be Cruf.
It would indeed. For Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Globe and Jerusalem are two types of what?
Globe and Jerusalem.
It's Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Two types of...
Grape.
That's just totally wrong. It's just like wrong.
Oh dear, Eddie. Oh dear, Eddie. They're artichokes. They're two types of artichoke.
Artichokes? Crikey, okay.
Globe artichoke, Jerusalem artichoke. Yeah. No? Dear me. What you must do, Eddie, once you've organised your next mortgages this afternoon, is you must go down to the supermarket, get yourself some artichokes, treat yourself, and then when you can come back on, assuming the same question comes back up, you'll know this one. Look, it's a pleasure to have you in the government as in charge of culture, media, and sport. I really feel we could have used a mortgage advisor as Chancellor. Maybe next time. Thank you very much, Eddie. Great pleasure to have you on.
Bye.
Thank you to everyone who's been with us today. I had so many messages during the speeches, which we haven't really had chance to read out so many of them. People saying Kemi's knocking it out the park. Other people saying, and Mary says, go Kemi, great speech. Wish she was a Lib Dem. I think she said that just before Kemi had a crack at the Lib Dems. So maybe that's not necessarily going to happen. Someone saying Kemi's speech is explosive. Kate in Aberdeenshire saying Kemi Badenoch's patronising tone of voice is enough to make you stop listening. Although someone else says I liked the laugh. Generic speech, a list of grievances, says Deb, and so on. Really, so many messages. They've been absolutely fascinating. I'm only sorry I haven't had the chance to read out more of them. I'm about to leave you. Thanks very much indeed for being with me. I'm of course with you tomorrow. I should like to thank Kemi Badenoch, James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick, and Tom Tugendhat for really doing so much of the heavy lifting over the last few hours, because they've really been a great help. Coming up on tomorrow's show, 25 years after he published The Tipping Point, the journalist, podcaster and author Malcolm Gladwell returns to the subject of his first book. He'll be my guest. Today's producer was Erin Carney and Ryan Boyden was pushing the buttons. Andrew Neil is up next. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Raring to go. Lots to talk about. Lots of news.
Were you listening to all of those speeches?
Yes, I did. While I was working, I tried to keep an eye on them. And we're going to speak to a couple of Conservatives about what they think, who's the front runner now. These four have to be whittled down to two, and then it goes to a vote among the membership in the country. So we'll see what's come out of this morning as a result of the beauty parade in Birmingham.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Yes, so many weeks left, and yet tense it is. I'll speak to you tomorrow, but don't go anywhere. Andrew Neil is up next. I've been Hugo Rifkind. I'll speak to you soon.
On DAB Digital Radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. News from every angle. Times Radio.
Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio. The world waits for Israel to retaliate after last night's mass ballistic missile attack by Iran. We'll bring you the latest developments and the sharpest analysis. The Tory party conference in Birmingham has been overshadowed by events in the Middle East, but the four remaining contenders for the Tory leadership paraded their wares before the party faithful this morning. We'll tell you who shone and maybe who bombed. And we'll do the same with last night's US vice presidential debate between Republican J.D. Vance and Democrat Tim Walz. All that and more in an hour of fast-moving news and analysis. But first, the latest headlines with Rachel Jewell.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon. Hezbollah says its fighters are clashing with Israeli forces in a border town this lunchtime. Israel has sent more troops into southern Lebanon after Iran fired nearly 200 ballistic missiles yesterday evening in revenge over the deaths of top militant leaders. British nationals in Beirut are being told to leave on a chartered flight put on by the Foreign Office. The former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, spoke to Times Radio.
I think what Israel wants to do is create a scenario where they convince Iran that further escalation is not in their interest and things can stop. That may involve some strikes on Iran, perhaps even their nuclear facilities, but I think not going so far as to try to force an all-out regime change.
Meanwhile, Israel's foreign minister has barred the UN Secretary General from entering the country. Yisrael Katz has accused Antonio Guterres of anti-Israel bias. The four candidates in the Conservative leadership race have been making their pitches in speeches at the party conference this morning. Tom Tugendhat promised a Conservative revolution if he wins the contest. James Cleverly has told party members they need to be more normal and more Ronald Reagan.
Even in the depths of the Cold War, he made Americans want to vote for a Conservative. Not reluctantly, but with enthusiasm. And then what did he do? He cut taxes, he cut regulation, he boosted military spending, and he won a landslide.
Robert Jenrick said there needs to be a new Conservative Party.
I am for finishing the job that we started with Brexit and restoring to our people and our Parliament its sovereignty. So under my leadership, the new Conservative Party will stand for a new Great Reform Act, one that leaves the ECHR, repeals Tony Blair's Human Rights Act and writes a British Bill of Rights.
Kemi Badenoch was the last to make her speech, saying the system is broken. It's been revealed 57 convicted criminals who were released early under a scheme to ease overcrowding in Scottish prisons are back behind bars. 477 inmates were let out as part of the project over the summer. Figures from the Scottish Prison Service show more than a third of those returned are accused of violent offences. 12 were free for less than 10 days. Rescuers are searching for more than 100 migrants off the coast of Djibouti after smugglers forced them to jump into the sea. That's according to the UN Migration Agency, which says at least 45 people have died after two small boats capsized. Another 154 have been rescued. Tens of thousands of women can't work because of menopause symptoms, according to a major report. The NHS Confederation found 66,000 are off with long-term sickness. Health chiefs say investing in women's health services like hormone replacement therapy could reduce the £1.5 billion hit to the economy. Now let's get the latest on the markets.
Times Radio Market Watch in association with Saxo. Premium investing now without the premium price tag. Search Saxo Invest for less. Capital at risk.
The FTSE 100 is up 10 points at 8,287. The FTSE 250 is down 122 points at 20,792. The pound's trading at €1.20 and is 1.33 against the dollar. And the fashion retailer JD Sports has reassured investors that it is on track to meet full-year targets despite its key supplier Nike reporting another big slowdown in sales. There's more on the business section of the Times website.
Times Radio Market Watch.
On DAB Digital Radio, on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker. Andrew Neil on Times Radio.
Good afternoon, I'm Andrew Neil and this is Times Radio. Yesterday on this programme we told you that Iran had few good options in retaliating against Israel for its offensive against Hezbollah, Iran's powerful, or maybe we should say once powerful, Lebanese-based proxy. 24 hours later, and it's clear raining down ballistic missiles in Israel for the second time this year was not one of these good options. As with the attack last April, so this time Iran failed to do much damage to Israel, and there are no reported Israeli fatalities. Most will credit the efficacy of Israel's missile defences. Some will see a second miracle of the year. Iran has played itself into a corner. Its Hezbollah allies are still under siege from Israel's onslaughts, and the Tehran regime now waits nervously to discover what Israel has in store for it. The one factor which has muted Israel's response in the past has been fear of attack by Hezbollah. That's no longer a constraint. Iran's insurance policy has been diminished. So we can be sure Israel's retaliation will be more substantial than the one attack it launched on an Iranian military facility after April. But it still might not be a massive attack. Jerusalem senses that Tehran is even less keen on an all-out war than Israel. But a 180 ballistic missile attack can hardly go unpunished. Israel will want Tehran to know it can strike any target in Iran. To illustrate that, it will likely pick and choose from Iran's missile sites, its drone plants, and maybe even its nuclear weapons development sites. It might even target the regime. Nobody at the top of the Iranian government can be sleeping soundly these days. We'll know in the next few days. The main constraint on Israel is its need to avoid fighting on too many fronts. It's still dealing with the remnants of Hamas. It's now engaged in decapitating and degrading Hezbollah. It has the Houthis to deal with in Yemen. All-out war with Iran might be a war front too far. But response there will be. If Israel wanted any encouragement, Hezbollah provided it this morning by launching 100 more rockets into northern Israel. I'm joined now by Larissa Brown, defence editor of The Times. Welcome, Larissa. And before I get on to some of these issues, let me ask you, you've got some breaking news that an Israeli commando unit clashed or was ambushed by Hezbollah near tunnels on the inside Lebanon, just north of the Israeli border.
Yes, this is one of my colleagues is on the ground with Israeli forces. And he's been told by one of those Israeli troops that, yes, they came up against an ambush inside southern Lebanon, and an unconfirmed number of Israeli soldiers were killed in that ambush. The details are that are still coming through, but of course, this would be the first time that Israeli troops have been killed on Lebanese soil as part of this ground invasion that they launched just a couple of days ago. The so-called sort of invasion was meant to be sort of limited strikes going into villages and towns near that border to dismantle Hezbollah's rocket facilities. But of course, they are likely to face intense bombardment from Hezbollah, which is dug into those hillsides and also has an extensive tunnel network underground, which means that they can pop up anywhere really behind the Israeli forces and ambush them, as we've seen in this scenario.
Indeed, well, we'll see what the developments are, because the great fear of Israel that this is the kind of thing it's now up against. It's been there before and it's been very difficult for it. Larissa, what's the latest on the prospects and manner of Israel's retaliation against Iran for last night's attack?
Well, we've heard from various people this morning, senior US officials, also obviously the Israelis, and Israel's top diplomat in the UK was warning this morning of severe consequences after last night's attack. I've been looking at various options that Israel could decide to go ahead with. Arab officials have been saying that actually Israel warned Iran that if it did go ahead with these strikes, as was widely anticipated, then Israel would strike back by hitting Iran's oil and nuclear facilities. Now, both of those targets would be considered quite a dramatic escalation that then presumably Iran would then want to respond to. There has been some suggestion actually in the in IRGC affiliated media outlets coming out of Iran that if Israel did choose to hit those oil facilities, then Iran would then retaliate by striking other oil facilities in the region, such as in Saudi Arabia, which would of course push up oil prices. If they then choose to hit those nuclear facilities instead, that would again be a huge escalation. Previously in April, Israel just attacked a site nearby those nuclear facilities, and that was sort of a symbolic act just to show Iran exactly what it was capable of. But if it directly goes ahead and targets those facilities, we can expect a huge escalation in the region, I think.
Does Iran have anything more powerful to throw at Israel compared to last night?
Well, you're touching upon the sort of ultimate weapon there, because what Iran could end up doing, one expert was telling me, is they could rapidly speed up their nuclear weapons program. They're not actually that far from having nuclear weapons. And the ultimate fear here is that Iran has all of its sort of facilities and weapons storage warehouses taken out by Israel, and it feels that the only option it has left is indeed its nuclear weapons. So it's all pretty terrifying, and there's a lot at stake here.
Which may be the reason why Israel will think the nuclear facilities are what should be attacked next if they haven't got conventional weapons any better than what they threw at Israel last night. Does Israel have enough anti-missile missiles in its various systems to deal with a further ballistic missile attack?
I think Iron Dome is pretty limitless. It costs about, I think, $100,000 for them to fire their defensive mechanism against.
But that's for short-range rockets coming in, isn't it?
Yes, and they've also got various other systems, including the Arrow system. I've not seen anything to suggest that Israel could run out of these capabilities, but of course, this war in general is having a huge economic toll on the Israeli government, and so it's not going to be able to last forever. But of course, they're reliant on help from the US, which is sending Israel billions. So they are getting the help that they need.
And of course, the US military was involved in helping Israel last night see off the Iranian attack. The British are claiming to have helped Israel last night too. If we did, it must have been pretty marginal.
It's a bit bizarre because we basically got this statement from John Healey, the Defence Secretary, last night, hours after this attack took place, basically saying that the Brits had played a role in helping to defend Israel. But it wouldn't go into any other detail, and I've been trying to speak to the MOD today, and again they won't offer up any more detail on what the role that Britain played was. We do know, however, that Typhoon aircraft were in the region at the time. They had been scrambled, but they can't defend against ballistic missiles. They can only defend against drones, which was the case in April. So they were used in April, but this time they weren't necessary. So whether that's what Healey is referring to, I'm not sure. It's possible that we had some sort of intelligence capability in the region, and we're sort of feeding Israel information about those missiles that had launched, but it's all a bit sort of strange, and we're not really getting those details.
I understand. I know exactly what you're saying. Larissa Brown, Defence Editor of The Times there. Thanks for joining us. Let's turn now to Bronwyn Maddox, Director of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That's the prestigious think tank that's often called Chatham House. Bronwyn, welcome to the programme. US Central Command was closely involved with the Israeli military in taking out Iran's ballistic missiles last night. It would seem that even when the US President and the Israeli Prime Minister are at loggerheads, which they are at the moment, Israel can always count on the US military.
Sandra, I'm so sorry. Your question cut out both at the beginning and the middle, and I didn't hear what.
All right, let me try again to see if you can hear me. I was saying that the U.S. Central Command was involved in last night's operations with Israel against the ballistic missiles, and remarking that even though the President and the Prime Minister, President of America, Prime Minister of Israel, are at loggerheads, Israel can always count on U.S. military assistance.
Well, it could in this particular case, but you're right, it marks a very distinct change by the US, which has been saying, this is the Biden administration saying to Israel for weeks, if not months, please don't escalate things. It was thinking particularly of the northern border of Lebanon. But on Iran, it does seem finally to have been persuaded by Israel that it should support it very, very actively, first in the defense, but then possibly in the what steps Israel chooses to take against Iran. That is the big question hanging there.
Indeed, and let me ask you about that, because after Iran's April attack on Israel, President Biden counseled caution, take the win, he said to Israel. Israel somewhat pretty much paid heed. It only did one military response. That's less likely to happen this time, isn't it? Even America itself is talking about, quote, serious consequences for Iran.
Yes, Biden is not saying take the win. He's talking about, as you said, really significant consequences for Iran. Whereas from Iran's point of view, it is signaling, look, we regard this as retaliation for you taking out Hassan Nasrallah, Hassan Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah. Call it quits at that point. But Israel is having none of that. The question, as you've been discussing already, is whether Israel chooses to try and hit at Iran's nuclear facilities, which are taking Iran to the edge of having a nuclear weapon. I think all you can say at this point is that Netanyahu has created the option of that. He's taken out a lot of Hezbollah, its leader, its communications, some of its forces to the north, and he couldn't ever attack Iran really with Hezbollah just sitting there on his northern border as a huge force. With that much weakened, it creates the option for him to do something more in Iran, but I don't think we can say anything more at this point.
I mean, given that Iran has now launched 2 missile rocket attacks and drones first time round on Israel, you can handle Iran to some extent as a non-nuclear power. It's an entirely different kettle of fish if it does become a nuclear power. Surely the pressure will be growing for a military response to Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons. And does Israel have the capability to do this on its own, or does it need America?
There is pressure to do that from the school of thought within Israel that says we must hit at every threat to us, and Iran is the threat above all other threats, and this is an existential threat. It wants us not to exist, so we've got to hit it and hit at these nuclear facilities. I don't think Israel has the capacity on its own to do more than knock back those facilities by a few years. Probably the same goes for the US, without causing huge casualties, because Iran's facilities, from what we know of them, are very much underground, they're hidden, they're deliberately dispersed, and this has gone on for decades.
There's a lot of media chatter, I'm sure you've seen it, scare talk about all-out war. Putting aside the nuclear issue, which we just discussed, what would all-out war look like? Between whom? And what would it be?
That is a brilliant question, which I'm not sure the government of Israel is actually addressing at the moment. It wants to retaliate. It wants, all right, so it might go for Israel's, for Iran's oil facilities, doing it some economic damage and just making the point. We can hit you and we can do you a lot of damage. It might, as we were just discussing, go for some of the things that support the nuclear program. That isn't all-out war, but each side is trying to have the last word, if you like. But that is a recipe for escalation.
It certainly is. Bronwyn Maddox, we'll leave it there for the moment, but I hope you come back and join us as this story develops, as undoubtedly it is going to be. That's the director of Chatham House there. You can follow all the latest developments at thetimes.com. There you'll find a live page keeping you up to date with events as they happen. Defence editor Larissa Brown, you just heard from her. She examines Britain's role in the defence of Israel, and there are regular dispatches from our reporters across the region. Coming up, Tariq Ahmad was the UK's Foreign Office Minister for the Middle East in the last government. He joins me next here on Times Radio. News here is that Israel is still adamant that it will retaliate against Iran for last night's ballistic missile attack and that it's sending more troops into southern Lebanon. The UK says our forces played a part in supporting Israel during last night's missile attack by Iran, though we haven't been able to discover what that really amounted to. Keir Starmer has condemned Iran's actions and says Britain stands with Israel, even though his government has instigated a partial arms embargo on Israel. The Conservative peer Tariq Ahmad, who was a Foreign Office Minister for the Middle East in the last government, claims the international community is collectively responsible for ending what he calls this carnage, bloodshed and destruction. He joins me now. Welcome to the programme. You say the international community is collectively responsible to end the carnage, the bloodshed, the destruction. Surely it would end most easily if Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran stopped trying to wipe out Israel.
Well, I agree with you on that exact point. I think consistently since the events and the tragic events of 7th of October, and here we are approaching the 12-month anniversary, there was one thing that I remember consistently saying as the Minister for the Middle East, and it was the collective position of the government that this can stop tomorrow if Hamas release the hostages and stop the war. Unfortunately, what we feared, and that's why I collectively use the word collectively, one of the primary objectives of every country that was involved, whichever lever they had, whichever influence they had over whichever party, that includes those who were negotiating with Hamas, that was a collective responsibility to stop escalation, as you've been saying, and I was listening to part of your conversation in Brownland as well, that it's beyond escalation. We're beyond the brink. What we have seen is Israel has gone in now to Lebanon. There were discussions previously on influences that could be brought about, ensuring that Hezbollah moved back north of the Litani River and the Lebanese forces took over control of the border points with Israel. Those now seem in a very, very different place. It's tragic what's happening. And of course, Iran, and we saw previously back in April when they launched their attack. And this attack that we saw from Iran yesterday was markedly different. It was ballistic missiles that were used this time. So there's the word escalation that was used consistently by all of us, that we must avoid escalation. The tragic nature is escalation has happened and it's happening now.
Indeed, and you, as Middle East Minister, you manfully traveled the region calling for de-escalation. You now say you admit that you didn't get anywhere, which is why we still have no idea of peace. But you say that the collective action, the UK government should be at the heart of it, using every lever, exerting every ounce of pressure and influence to end this destruction and human suffering. But what does that entail that we and other European countries have not already done?
Well, I think, again, earlier you were talking about the role of the United States, and we're very much aligned, the partner and ally to the United States, on influencing Israel to bring this to a halt. We've seen changes within Israel since the 7th of October. You now have people who were served in the government, including people I met with, such as Benny Gantz, who left. There are others, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, previously prior to the Lebanese invasion, or the invasion into Lebanon, had raised the issue of the endgame, the need in Gaza, because that's where the focus was initially, to have an endgame.
And it's all made no difference, hasn't it? I mean, you talk about levers. I mean, what levers? Against whom? What collective action? What pressure? What influence? I mean, it's not going to work, is it? It hasn't worked. I mean, I would put it to you, if the United States can't exert much influence on the Netanyahu government, which clearly it cannot, you can't expect Britain or our European allies to have much influence either.
Well, that's why I use the word, Andrew, collective, because it's not about one country. It's those countries that have influence over whichever players taking part in this conflict. For example, one of the challenges we faced consistently is with this situation with Iran. The United Kingdom government took a position to retain its embassy in Tehran to ensure that some of those messages diplomatically, discreetly, and one thing I learned over 7 years at the Foreign Office was that discreet diplomacy is important. That continues today, and I'm sure that is continuing with our current government in association with the United States and other EU allies. Can it happen? Well, if we go back in history, there was a time when the challenges were immense in the Middle East. You'll recall this. I go back to the times of James Baker, when he brought up the issue of loan guarantees, which ensured Israel came to the table. And there are levers, and I come back to that point. What we've seen previously in Lebanon, and let's take that conflict first, that we've seen 3 invasions previously, all have ended in a more ugly status quo. Clearly, ultimately, when that happens, I can't speculate on, but when it happens, ultimately there has to be a diplomatic track, and that's where these levers are important. Who has influence over Hamas, for example? The role that Qatar have been playing, Egypt, I think is important. But we also need people within Israel. And what Mr. Netanyahu and members of his government, and certainly I've called out quite publicly the likes of Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir as part of the extreme in his government, are obstacles to peace. We need people who will mediate a peace. More recently, we've seen ex-prime ministers such as Fuad Ahmed, who I know extremely well, get together with a previous foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, Dr. Nasser Kidwa, and present a plan.
But, and I think we're further away from peace than ever. I mean, I understand all these developments and these opinions, but you conclude peace is the radical solution. Peace is the only solution. Amen to that. It's a nice slogan for a T-shirt, but in the context of what's happening as we speak, it means nothing.
Well, you said amen to it. As a Muslim, I'd say Ameen as well. And I think what we've seen through previous conflicts that have taken part in the Middle East, and indeed the word radical solution was used by no one else other than Yitzhak Rabin, when he realized here was someone who fought hardened wars, who led Israel, but also realized that the real radical solution comes not from conflict, doesn't come from war, doesn't come from building walls, doesn't come from tanks. It comes from peace, but it needs the courage and conviction and principle of taking that step forward. Now, I fully accept the premise that where we are today from where we were on the 7th of October, or even before, we're in a much far worse place. The situation is escalating, and it's beyond an escalation. As I said, we are in a situation of live war in the Middle East. The situation in Gaza continues to mean that hostages are again being held in Gaza. Palestinians continue to suffer. Aid isn't going in consistently. And now we see an escalation into Lebanon, a country itself which was very much on the knees. But you should never, and I believe firmly on this, notwithstanding the current conflict taking place, there are countries, the United States being primary amongst them, who can influence, can bring this conflict to an end by ensuring that Israel, through whatever means it's currently deploying, also realizes, and there are people in Israel who realize just that to end this conflict means an end to the conflict in Gaza, but also an objective that ultimately the key principle, the radical solution, and I stand by that, will be a diplomatic solution and a situation which leads to peace in the Middle East.
Indeed, and all hostilities at some stage end, I understand that. But we seem to be at the moment, just as a final point I'd put to you, that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, last night Iran attacked Israel with 181 ballistic missiles. I mean, Israel cannot be expected just to turn the other cheek. It's the second time it's happened this year. I mean, we wouldn't turn the other cheek. I don't think we could expect Israel to do so either, can we?
Well, I think what we've seen coming out from Israel is that they will revenge this particular attack. I was there in government when the attack happened, which was pretty much telegraphed, as you'll recall, Andrew.
Yes.
When we saw those.
Yes, indeed. Less this time, though. Not so much telegraphing this time.
Not at all. And the missiles, these were different types of attack. These were ballistic missiles. And people talked about the JCPOA, but you'll know from your own information, from your own knowledge, that the JCPOA never covered the ballistic missile. We're on the brink here, and it does need cool heads to prevail. You know, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind really comes to mind. And, you know, the one thing I've sort of seen through my own engagement, through the relationships the United Kingdom has. And that's why I believe we do have a key role to play with our partners, with the Europeans, but most certainly with the United States, is to exert the influence, often diplomatically, but quietly and discreetly, to ensure that that dialogue, those diplomatic channels, no matter how challenging the current situation is, do continue to exist and continue to function.
Tariq Ahmed, Conservative peer, former Foreign Office Minister, thanks for sharing your expertise and experience with us today. All four pretenders to the Tory throne were strutting their stuff during the last day of the Tory conference in Birmingham this morning. It was their last major workout before MPs vote to cut the candidates down to two, and then the final choice of these two goes to the party members across the country. So who did well? Who'll get through? Who'll win? Analysis and predictions next, after the headlines with Rachel Jewell.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Good afternoon. Israel says it's beefed up its forces on the border with Lebanon as fighting with Hezbollah intensifies following Iranian missile attacks last night. Meanwhile, it's been confirmed British forces were involved in efforts to defend Israel from the barrage. All four Conservative candidates have attacked Labour, looked back on why they lost the election and are promising to be the one to take the party forward. Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch have addressed members on the final day of their conference in Birmingham. There were a couple of moments where audience participation didn't quite match what the candidates may have been expecting, though.
Well, good morning, conference. Should we try that again? I'm a Midlands man. I grew up just down the road in Wolverhampton. And it's good to be back.
One of the UK's most wanted men has been jailed for 20 years after masterminding a plot to smuggle nearly a ton of cocaine from South America to Scotland, hidden in a cargo of bananas. Jamie Stevenson, known as Iceman, pleaded guilty to directing the importation of the drug, which was seized by Border Force teams at Dover in September 2020. And police say there's no evidence a taxi carrying Have I Got News For You star Ian Hislop was hit by a gunshot. Officers initially responded to reports of a firearms discharge after the car's window shattered in Soho in central London. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
This is Times Radio.
Are you being
And on your smart speaker, Andrew Neil on Times Radio.
A little bit more news from the Middle East. Israel has barred the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, from entering the country. Israel's foreign minister criticised him for failing to forcefully condemn Iran's missile attack last night. The Conservative Beauty Parade has come to an end in Birmingham, a full house for all four leadership contenders as they gave their speeches to the party faithful over the last couple of hours. MPs will now surgically remove two of them and leave two left for a vote that goes to the country. Let's have a listen to what they've been saying. First up was Tom Tugendhat, whose address was peppered with references to his military service and included a direct pitch to voters who abandoned the party.
If you went to Reform, I want to show you the Conservative values that we share. If you went to the Lib Dems, I want you to see the opportunities that only we can deliver. And if you went to Labour, I want to show you why freedom, not state control, is how we build. If you stayed at home, I want to make you proud to vote Conservative again.
That was Tom Tugendhat. James Cleverly, meanwhile, opened with an apology for the last few years, but he had a straightforward idea for his party.
Let's be enthusiastic, relatable, positive, optimistic. Let's be more normal. Let's sell the benefits of conservatism with a smile.
Normal? They will never catch on. Robert Jenrick was up next, promising to campaign for an effective freeze on net migration.
If we do that, we give our country the effective breathing space that we need. Will we be open to the best and the brightest? Yes, absolutely. Will we be open to the world and its wife and all their extended family? No.
And finally, Kemi Badenoch, who had a simple diagnosis for what went wrong for her party.
If Conservative principles are so great, why aren't we in government anymore? The truth is, we lost faith and stopped acting like Conservatives. We stopped being leaders and became managers. We spoke right and governed left, and when we went after Labour votes, we lost our own.
So, where does all this leave the Tory leadership? These 4 will be whittled down to 2 by a further vote by MPs, and the 2 remaining go to the members in the country, and it's the membership that decides in the end who the leader will be. I'm joined now by David Gauke, who was a Treasury Minister in the last Tory government, and Mark Littlewood, Director of the Popular Conservatism Movement. The Popcons, they call themselves, and Liz Truss is one of the backers. So, who came out best this morning? David Gauke.
I thought that the best performance was James Cleverly. Personally, I think Tom Tugendhat would make the best leader of the Conservative Party, but on the performance today, I thought James's pitch about normality, about politics with a smile on his face, there was a lot of channeling Ronald Reagan, and I think it worked. It seemed to work in the hall. I was watching on television, but it seemed to work in the hall, and it seemed to work on television. So I thought he had the best morning, and probably has quite a bit of momentum going into the final MP rounds next week.
Mark Littlewood.
I think I don't disagree with that, and not just on the 20-minute speech. By most accounts, James Cleverly is considered to have had a very good conference. He's an avuncular kind of guy. He goes down very well at the drinks receptions. He's probably the wittiest of the 4 candidates. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're prime ministerial material, but it does mean that there's a warm glow around you with fellow MPs and activists. Robert Jenrick, the front runner, difficult place to be. Probably wanted to play it quite safe, but I thought his presentation was strong. Kemi Badenoch probably had a rather rocky conference, and if you believe the betting markets as an indication, well, the odds on her were drifting very, very badly. But actually, after her speech, which is more vision than policy, she's clocked back a bit. Money's started to go back on her. But the betting markets will now say Jenrick and Cleverly are the 2 front runners. Tom Tugendhat, perfectly serviceable speech, but if as a betting man, I would say he's likely the next one out. He gave a reasonable speech, but didn't hit a home run, and he probably needed one.
Now, they all sang, as you would expect, some old Tory songs, familiar words, familiar positions, familiar principles. But David, did any of them have something original to say, something new, something forward-looking?
Not really. I mean, all were doing their best, if you like, all trying to sort of convey a sense of we've got to be forward-looking. And I don't think one should necessarily expect lots of detailed policy at this point. But I don't think that any of the candidates at any point in this have done enough to face up to the predicament the Conservative Party is in. I think because clearly the Labour government is running into some difficulties, that there's a bit too much complacency within the party, a bit of a sense of, well, we just pull ourselves together, we'll be fine. I think they need to do much more to distance themselves from the issues of integrity that occurred under Boris Johnson and the issues of economic incompetence that occurred under Liz Truss. And none of the candidates have been prepared to do that, to put that distance between themselves and what has happened in recent years. And I think that's a real problem for the Tory party. I think it's got to do that. It's got to go through that process. And however much, for example, Robert Jenrick talked about the new Conservatives, clearly channeling Tony Blair and New Labour, he didn't really set out anything very different other than, we'll do what we've done before, but more so.
Exactly, which isn't really new. It's a repeat. Right. I think people who are not Conservatives will wonder what on earth of the Tories to be complacent about after July the 4th. But Mark, which one, in your view, has the best strategy for dealing with Nigel Farage and reform? Because without some kind of strategy to handle that, a comeback is going to be very difficult.
Very difficult indeed, Andrew. And I would say, on the face of it, Robert Jenrick probably has the best strategy with regard to Farage and reform. He hasn't quite said so in terms, although he has said his mission would be to try and put Farage and reform out of business. And he's been the one who's been most unambiguous on the ECHR issue. He actually said in his speech, the choice is leave or remain, very similar to the Brexit referendum, and he was unambiguously for leave. And I think he's probably got the right strategy here, because we heard from on your clip earlier, Andrew, that Tom Tugendhat had a message for people who defected to Labour, people who defected to the Lib Dems, and people who had defected to Reform. And whilst it's true that obviously the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats took many more seats off the Conservatives than Reform, this was by and large because the Conservatives were leaking votes to Reform. So many votes left the Conservative column into the Reform column that suddenly the Liberal Democrats, without any measurable uptick in their vote share, were able to win seats just because the Conservative vote was falling. So if you think the route back, and it wouldn't be enough to win an election outright by doing this, but the first step on the route back is to try and get, I don't know, 5, 6, 7% of the electorate who voted Reform back into the Conservative column. It seems to me that Jenrick is the most laser-focused and unambiguous about that being his first target.
The problem, David, as you look abroad, where mainstream parties of the right have been overtaken by populist parties of the right, is that I can't see any examples where the mainstream party of the right then won back the vote of the populist party. If anything, the populist parties at the moment, anyway, have continued to grow in strength. Look at Austria only several days ago. Look how Trump is still again the candidate for the Republicans. Marine Le Pen has seen off the Republican Party in France. It's a tough one to do that and at the same time win back Lib Dem votes. I mean, you might say it's mission impossible to do both.
Well, there's no doubt that centre-right parties face a very challenging strategic backdrop. There's no doubt about that. You could look at Germany, where you have got the CDU likely to be back in government at the time of the next election. But I do think it would be a mistake to focus.
It has moved to the right, David, though. It has moved. Compared to the days of Angela Merkel, it is now substantially to the right, probably more to the right than you would like.
That's probably true, but I do think it's a mistake to focus purely on reform. And if your message is essentially, Nigel Farage is right in his diagnosis of the country, but don't vote for him, I think you run into difficulties. You give people sort of validation for the Farage critique of the country, and you can always be outflanked. And that's the problem that if you go down the Robert Jenrick route, is that, who is the better politician, communicator as a right-wing populist? Is it Robert Jenrick or Nigel Farage? Well, if you're looking for a right-wing populist, I'm afraid Nigel Farage is going to be better at that than Robert Jenrick is. And you do have to look at those votes that are going to Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservatives have to offer a genuine alternative to Labour at the next general election. And then some of those Reform voters who were just fed up with the Tories and didn't really care who won, if there is a real contest between those two parties, then a lot of those Reform voters can potentially come back to the Conservatives if they feel the Conservatives look competent, offer integrity, and have a sense of direction. And that was what was lacking at the last general election for the Conservatives.
I mean, the problem with Mr. Jenrick in some ways is that he'd be up against Nigel Farage, household name, probably the highest profile politician in the country, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister, household name. And I'm not sure outside the Tory party anybody's ever heard of Mr. Jenrick, but I guess if he become leader, we soon would. Let me ask you this to both of you. I'll start with you, Mark. Is it wise to leave the final say to Tory party members? I mean, there are not very many of them these days, and they're certainly not representative of the country. I mean, they voted for Liz Truss.
Yeah, it's interesting whether you think that the party's got the leadership election right. It's an oddity, really, isn't it? I mean, I think it would be the problem the Conservative Party's got is that the grassroots, such as it is, and you're right, Andrew, it's been radically diminished. I mean, the party lost 2/3 of its seats on July the 4th overnight. But if you were to look back to the 2001 Conservative leadership election, so just over 20 years ago, north of 300,000 ballot papers were issued to Tory party members then. I don't know what the number will be this time, maybe 100, maybe 120,000. But I think
that low, I was thinking 150, but you think it could be as low as between 100 and 120?
I do. I think it was about 150, 160,000 for the Truss-Sunak battle, and my guess would be membership would have fallen since then. But I think that however you do it, and when the members should have a say, if the parliamentary party picks a leader who isn't popular and acceptable to the grassroots of the party, you've got to. Oh,
we seem to have lost Mark Littlewood there. David, we've still got you, which I hope we have. I'll come to you finally with the same question, David. Is it wise to leave the final say to Tory party members?
No, I don't think it is. As Mark has said, the party membership has reduced a great deal. But look, it's the MPs who know the candidates best. It's the MPs, after all, who then have to serve under them in Parliament. And indeed the MPs who can remove a leader as well. So I think it's a mistake. And what is happening is that MPs already how they're casting their votes now are second guessing what the members are going to do. They're not just choosing who they think would be the best leader of the Tory party. They're thinking about who can win amongst the members. I think it's a mistake. The membership is very narrow, small, unrepresentative of the people the Conservative Party needs to win over if they are to get back into power. And I think it would be much better if that power was returned to the MPs. I speak as someone who is not an MP, but I am a Conservative Party member. I don't think I should have a vote in this election.
Very well. That's a self-denying ordinance. A good point to finish on there. I'm glad we just got Mark Littlewood back to let us know you're all right, but we're going to have to end it there. That was David Gauke and Mark Littlewood on the Tory party leadership race. Coming up, so much for that leadership contest. What about the battle for the White House? It's a little bit more important, I think we can all agree. The VP candidates locked horns in a TV debate last night. Who won? More importantly, will it make any effect on the result? More of that in a couple of minutes. This is Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio.
Asma Mir and Stig Abel on Times Radio Breakfast with Nationwide.
We were just learning that last night's missile attack by Iran did some damage in Israel. An Air Force base sustained a few hits, but the Israeli military saying there's no harm to the functionality of the base and that the Israeli Air Force is fully functioning, of course. But unlike April, some of the missiles got through to do some damage this time, but nothing like what it could have been but for Israel's Iron Dome and other defensive systems. Now, if it was boxing, we'd call it probably, I don't know, something done on the card, something done on points. J.D. Vance didn't land a knockout punch, but he won on points against Tim Walz. Of course, I'm talking about last night's US presidential TV debate in New York. Probably the final double-header set piece before polling day, since Donald Trump says he doesn't want to debate Kamala Harris again. First on the agenda in last night's debate was, of course, the Middle East, and Walz, the running mate of Kamala Harris, made an unconvincing start.
October 7th, Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,400 Israelis and took prisoners. Israel's ability to be able to defend itself is absolutely fundamental. Getting its hostages back, fundamental, and ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
But he was on stronger ground when pressing J.D. Vance, that's Donald Trump's running mate, about the January 6th Capitol riots.
This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further.
Will Pavia, the New Yorker correspondent for The Times, joins me now. Will, thanks for coming on to the show. The consensus seems to be that J.D. Vance did better than expected and Mr. Walls did less well than expected. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I mean, I think if you were sort of doing expectations management, and perhaps both sides were a little bit, J.D. Vance came into this debate with a sort of hard-edged persona. And I must admit, I thought that he was going to go really hard on Wals's claim that he'd sort of fabricated his military record, or that he'd, quit the National Guard just before his unit was deployed to Iraq. I thought he would do all this kind of stuff. And actually, he was just incredibly nice throughout the debate and sort of introduced himself to people. And you could imagine Americans watching in their living rooms thinking, this looks like a very nice young man who's sort of standing here, very polished, very smooth. Whereas Tim Walz, especially in the first sort of 45 minutes, he took a while to get going. And he was halting. I mean, he's the governor of Minnesota, so possibly he doesn't have a policy on whether Iran should, be attacked for bombing Israel. But he just was quite halting. There were these pauses where he was trying to sort of get to what he meant. And we've had this image of him as this sort of rather cuddly kind of figure, and this, Midwestern dad, and this guy who fixed old cars and would come and help you in a snowstorm and so on. And we got a little bit of that as he warmed up, but initially I think he was slightly wrong-footed.
He seemed, Mr. Walls has had been a stranger to the truth on a number of occasions on not hugely important matters, but nevertheless, he's not always been exactly honest. I think he came in with a bit of trouble last night when I think at one stage he had claimed he was in Tiananmen Square on the famous night of when the Chinese army put down the protesters, and he wasn't. And his explanation was that sometimes he can be a bit of a knucklehead.
Yes, sometimes he misspeaks. Sometimes he says more than he means to. Yeah, the backstory is that when he was a teacher, he ran these sort of exchange programs where he took students to China. He'd been a teacher himself in China, and so he went to China the summer of the Tiananmen Square massacre, but I think when he was running for Congress and in the past, he sort of suggested that he was in Hong Kong as it happened, and that I think it happened in May, and he arrived in August. And he'd sort of given the impression that people had warned him not to go, and he'd gone anyway. So yes, he sort of had to own up to some of these times where he's sort of he's shaded the truth, and he did, calling himself a knucklehead. I don't know if that was seen as charming by people who are watching, or if they thought, oh, hang on, we can't trust this guy.
Or it will be used against. We've only got a few seconds left. J.D. Vance came across, I'm not saying that this is what he is, but he seemed to come across and want to be seen as almost a kind of more reasonable, less deranged character than Trump.
Yes, that's certainly what was seen as his great selling point, was that he could give this very reasonable sort of policy-based explanation of whatever Trump says. He could sort of cast it as something that might be more recognizable to voters who are a little bit more moderate in their leanings. And he certainly did that with lots of questions. There were occasions he did struggle a bit on abortion, but when he was talking about the economy, he gave this very sort of intellectual kind of explanation of what Trump did and cast Trump as this brilliant sort of person who'd stood up to the experts and defied common sense and had been proven right. And you could see that being quite compelling, possibly, for some people watching.
And just very quickly, in a word, will it make any difference? Yes or no?
Not much.
All right, that's 2 words, but we'll give you that.
Sorry.
Will Pavey there, New York correspondent for The Times. That's it for me today, but I'll be back on Times Radio tomorrow. Coming up, Jane Garvey and Fee Glover.
On DAB Digital Radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. Life from every angle. Times Radio.